Once again, fighting corruption is at the heart of Philippine political discourse. Good governance is the new vogue in town. But is corruption really the root of all evil in the Philippines? To what degree is corruption a cause rather than effect of our democratic troubles and deficits? More specifically, is the Philippines really one of the most corrupt countries in the world? What factors explain the prevalence of corruption? And more importantly, what is the best way to deal with poverty and inequality and unemployment in the Philippines? Is industrial policy or other relevant developmental policies crucial to better understanding our current predicament? How can we create a robust economy in the Philippines? How can we help to make our democracy more mature? To better understand these issues, we have a special guest, one of the leading economists and observer of Philippine society. Dr. Felipe, thank you so much for joining us. I've been looking forward to this conversation. I think it's been what, 15 years since last time we met. I was just a humble student, one of those fools just coming in and trying to bask in your wisdom. But kidding aside, of course, this conversation builds on an earlier episode we had with Dr. Lisandro Claudio from University of California, Berkeley, whereby we tried to really go against this received wisdom on economic policies. And to be honest, I don't know how is it in your native land of España, but here, unfortunately, in the Philippines, and probably you know more than me, there's almost this kind of a fossilized discourse about economics, right? This basically it's like corruption is the mother of all evil, not only ethically and morally, but also in terms of productivity. The reason I'm talking about this is that as of this taping, corruption is a big issue once again in the country because, maybe the last time we were talking, it was the mother of all scandals measured at 10 billion pesos. Now we're looking at $10 billion potentially. So I completely understand emotionally why people are feeling this is the explanation for everything. But as an economist, as a real economist, as an unorthodox, outside-the-box, world-class economist, and I mean it in a complimentary way, Professor Felipe, what is really the role of corruption in explaining economic growth and productivity?
Oh, in a nutshell, much less than what most people think. Corruption matters, and it should not be underestimated, its importance, but it is more an ethical issue. In other words, if tomorrow corruption disappears in the Philippines, it is not that this is going to guarantee a growth rate of, let's say, 10%. The best way to explain this is, you look at the examples of other Asian countries that have grown much faster than the Philippines.
Turkey and Thailand have almost the same CPI, like corruption index rankings as the Philippines.
Yeah. That means that it is not really corruption. You want to eliminate corruption for ethical issues. Now, what happens is that the elimination of corruption goes sort of the other way around. Is when countries develop. You think that Sweden was not a corrupt country when it was at the level of the Philippines? Of course, yes. It happens to be the other way around. When the country grows, when the country develops, wages increase, incomes of public officials increase, and really bribing them becomes a very, very difficult issue. They will not accept it when the policemen in the street. And the other thing is that the systems in place will improve. I don't know if you're familiar now, there's a big corruption scandal in Spain. It wants to be solved for ethical issues. Nobody claims that when corruption is eliminated, this case is solved in Spain, Spain will grow much faster. That has nothing to do. So no, this is important, and it has to be, it cannot be dismissed, but at the same time, it is not the explanation of growth, much less of productivity, which is ultimately a firm level issue. Right. The reason why our productivity is on the aggregate is very low is that we have very inefficient firms because they lack what we call organizational capabilities. It is not really the corruption, the type of corruption that you were asking me, is not really what explains it.
So there's kind of like a Kuznets curve there, whereby when the income levels are low, corruption tends to go high, and then at some point, when you have a stronger middle class, a media which is also well paid, because our concern sometimes with all self-criticism, there are also people in the media who sometimes you're not sure whether they're doing their job here or doing puff pieces and fluff pieces.
Exactly. And that's what you will see in the Philippines happening.
Unfortunately, right? So the idea here is that corruption could be more of a effect sometimes rather than just a cause, right?
Oh, definitely.
Because the most influential studies, I'm sure you have your opinion on this, is this, for instance, studies about correlation, not causation, but correlation between dynasties, proliferation of political dynasties, and corruption. And some of us read it like, it looks like corruption sometimes is more of an effect rather than a cause. So what is your reading of the literature about the Philippines in terms of the impact of corruption on growth?
No, no, it's exactly what you were describing. I mean, we need to differentiate between what is correlation and what is causation. And it is no, I have not read any study that really shows that there is a causation that goes from corruption to the economic performance of the country. In many countries, I mean, the technical term when we talk of corruption in the end ends up being generational rents. Rents exist in every country. The rents that, for example, were created in Asian economies, when they were growing much faster than the Philippines in the 1970s and 80s, was much higher than here, were much higher than in the Philippines. The question is, what do you do with that?
Yeah.
And if you have a system that really forces companies, and the best example is probably Korea, to really reinvest and to do other things. So corruption, one will have to really get into the details of how much is it, and what is happening, who is taking it, and
Or
all that.
type of corruption, right? So you have certain works looking at, for instance, distinction between access corruption, the kind of corruption that businessmen, bribe an official to get the license and build a factory and create jobs. And then there's
Exactly.
grand theft.
Exactly.
Get the money, put it in Cayman Islands, and have a good life.
Those are the first one is what we call Schumpeterian rents.
Right,
That is
right.
the Schumpeterian rents that really, I will be the first one to say, yes, okay, let's support it. If the outcome is going to be what you described, that somebody's going to set up a factory, the factory is going to create employment and jobs and incomes, et cetera, et cetera. That's absolutely correct. Yeah.
Now, having said that, what are the other myths that you feel are bedeviling economic discourse in the country? My understanding is that, not long ago, you had a very popular mayor, Vico Soto, who's considered to be one day presidential. Well, who knows? Maybe if they change the constitution, he can run in 2028. He said, what is this obsession about surplus? In fact, if you have surplus in your budget, it means you lost an opportunity to invest in your infrastructure. Yeah. That this obsession about debt ratios, debt to income ratios, this obsession about savings misses the point because, again, state institutions are not family units. They're not firms, right? So they have a different kind of logic to how they operate with their monetary policy. Could you explain that? Because I know you have dealt with a lot of high-level officials and you have noticed the same kind of, I would say...
frustration.
Let's say pre-classical understanding of 1920s understanding of economics.
Yes. No, excellent question, Richard. Really appreciate it. Because probably it is the biggest misunderstanding among both government officials and people in the private sector. And it is the misunderstanding of government finances, the creation of money in terms such as a fiscal deficit or debt, which by the nature of the term, they have a negative connotation.
Sure.
You talk about deficit and immediately it's a negative connotation. Now what happens is the first mistake or the origin of the problem or the fallacy comes from what you are saying, is what we call the family analogy. It is true that you and I, in our households, do have a budget constraint.
Right.
You cannot, in the long run, spend much more than what you earn. Sooner or later, somebody will come after you. Governments are completely different entities and animals for a number of reasons. And one of them is that, well, first of all, everybody needs to understand, governments do not get any income. Taxes are not really income. Taxes is something that we all are forced to pay. But apart from that, is that governments use what we call fiat money. And fiat money has been used for decades. It is a creation of the state and the central bank.
It's not pegged to a certain metal.
Nothing
or
at all, exactly. That's what it is.
Yeah.
That's what do you go to the central bank, you go to BSP with your bill of 1,000 peso, you ask them to give you gold and they will laugh at you. Yeah. They will give you another one, or they will give you 2 500s or 10 100.
Hundreds, yeah.
That's it. That's one thing that it goes. The second one is the misunderstanding that well, first of all, a deficit of the public sector simply means that the government has given the private sector more than it has collected in terms of taxes. That's very, very clear. People do not understand.
Right.
The government has given the private sector 100 in government expenditure, and it has collected 50. So you need to start by asking is, what is your problem with that? Because if you want the government to run a surplus, it means that the government will collect in taxes more than you pay. And the first effect will be on the private sector disposable income. That is the first thing.
Yeah.
Linked to that is a story you need to ask, how do governments spend today? And this is probably the most mysterious aspect of the story. if I tell you governments do not use taxes to pay for absolutely anything, governments, all they use is somebody in treasury and somebody in the budget department authorizing a payment. Is a payment that goes from one account, is an electronic payment, to another account in a bank, to you. So imagine that you are Richard Haydaran and you are awarded a 500 million peso contract to build something. All I do, ultimately there are a lot of gimmicks in between, is a transfer to your account. Am I transferring pesos? Absolutely nothing. Nothing to do with that. You simply get a credit in your account and you might maintain it there, or at one point you might use it in different forms. You might transfer that into somebody else. So can governments do that permanently? That's exactly what they do. So it is simply not true that governments need to collect taxes in advance to make payments. From an accounting point of view, also what we call the budget deficit is peso por peso, a surplus of the private sector. And there are people who know that here in the Philippines, certainly in Japan, as you know, is permanently running a deficit.
200% of the GDP.
Of GDP, and the country
But
goes.
it's public debt, meaning it's domestically generated.
Oh, you need
right?
two things, of course. It's very
Exactly.
important
Compared
to
to your
differentiate.
country like España and the so-called pigs country,
Those
they
are
have
euros. Euros.
Right,
You don't have, you cannot, quote unquote, generate euros on your own. The Philippines is a sovereign country and can make payments in peso without any, unless somebody imposes a law, but that law will be invented. There is nothing on paper that prevents the government, in coordination with the central bank, to spend in the country's currency what is called peso. And the same thing that happens with the fiscal deficit, it happens with the so-called debt, national debt in peso. The national debt in peso is somebody's wealth, and that is in the private sector. Most of it is in the banking system because they're the one who buys the T-bills. But it doesn't matter, it's the private sector in general. You and I can buy debt in the secondary market.
Right.
So in other words, suppose that I ask you, what is your wealth position? And you will tell me, I own 3 cars, 2 apartments, and 3 million pesos in T-bills. That's identical to what you as the government has debt. It's not a problem. And that's how countries operate and work. You don't want that. You need to ask the private sector to return all the debt. And I guarantee you that will cause a massive crisis. So related to what you are asking and saying is, what about all these ratios that we have, the 50, 60, 70%?
Debt to GDP ratios.
Debt to GDP ratios, they don't play any role. In the most obvious case,
is there any threshold?
No, absolutely not. Well, we go to these examples.
Yeah.
Japan or the US have been, well, Japan has been running deficits, massive deficits.
But they'll say US, well, because they have the global currency,
no,
they can abuse it.
That's not the reason. The reason is that they use dollars, which is the currency that they produce. Now, what is the problem, the difference with the Philippines? That we can use peso, but it is also true that we need dollars. Why do we need dollars? Because we need to import, for example, capital goods that are important for our for development machines.
Not an international
machines,
currency,
because we don't generate those things. Not only that, you want to go to a shop and buy a bottle of Spanish wine that has been paid in euros. But that's a different story. But what is fundamental for development is that we need those euros. So when we generate debt in euros or in yen or in dollars, that causes potentially a problem because the country needs to generate really that currency in order to repay. This is not the problem today. In other words, the share of foreign debt in total debt in the Philippines is like 30%, perfectly manageable. On that point of view, I think Treasury...
And if it reaches 60%, that's also something manageable for you in your eyes?
Well, foreign debt, you mean?
No, debt to GDP ratio.
Well, what happens in the Philippines is that when the government tells us the 60%, is mixing both of them. Because in the Philippines, for reasons that that I don't even understand, they put both together. You know, they get the foreign debt multiplied by the exchange rate, and they put it together.
So that's the methodology.
That is how they do it. That is how they do it. So in total is that amount. But really, what matters is that really the understanding that what you call debt is really wealth of the private sector, and the Philippines would never have any problem returning or paying debt in peso, unless somebody in the government or the central bank decides not to honor it for political reasons, but not because we do not have pesos. That is incorrect.
Credit ratings. What about the credit rating aspect? Because this is always there is the fiat of the government, but there's also the confidence of the markets that is usually used as a basis to push for austerity. I mean, the most extreme case is Milei in Argentina, trying to gut out the whole system, saying, we need to raise the credit ratings of Argentina so that it's cheaper to borrow. We have to bring down the inflation. What do you say against that kind of a libertarian, let's call it, argumentation?
Well, it is the misunderstanding of rating agencies of what we're discussing. But what happens is that governments like the Philippines fall prey to that type of argument. What you need is somebody in the government saying, no, this is really not a problem. In fact, what we are doing is, this is a government that is spending on the right things. What do we want to spend on, Richard? We want to spend on infrastructure. We want to spend on education. You want to spend on health. And those are the things that will help the country move up.
And you'll get a return on investment on that.
Well, the return is, you need to understand the way, but not a return in the same way that you would talk about private investment.
Sure.
These are public goods that are being provided. There is no return in the sense of 12%. If what you're doing is lifting the country. What is the problem? One of the biggest problems that we have in a country with education. Well, education is children malnourished. Can that problem be solved? Immediately. I mean, school programs to feed children, the way it was done in developed countries in the 20th century, the way it's been done in other countries, massively.
Costa Rica, I think.
Costa Rica, Indonesia is doing now. So you do not tell me that costs money.
Right.
It is the wrong way to do it. You think, for example, of one of the dilemmas now of the Department of Education. They have estimated a shortage of 160,000 classrooms. They claim it costs money. No, you pay for them with your pesos. What does that do? You use the resources of the country, the construction companies that are going to build that. So if you are always thinking about public goods in terms of what it costs me, of course you get into this fallacy that we're discussing. The evaluation is in terms of using the nation's resources, which is a construction company that will call somebody to provide materials and cement and bricks, etc., and build those things.
And creates its own job.
And it creates its own job. Of course. Yeah. That's what it is.
So much more of a fiscal expansionary kind of a new Keynesian kind of approach, you would say.
I would call it more all Keynesian. But it's not even that about this dilemma of whether it's all or new Keynesian. It's something very pedestrian, which is really about really understanding the finances of the country.
Which doesn't work like an accounting ledger of a company or a family.
Far from that.
Yeah.
Far from that. And that is really damaging the country tremendously. I want to make the point clear that my statements or my explanations do not imply that I'm asking or I'm saying the government should spend as if there is no tomorrow. All I'm saying.
Nor are we saying corruption is good, right? We're putting things into context, right?
Exactly. Yeah. The context is finance cannot start any discussion about the budget or the budget department by saying we don't have resources, because peso is not a resource, because it's not scarce. So what we need to set is a budget that says this is what we want to be as a nation. Do we have the financial resources? Of course, yes. We may not have, or we may have, for example, real constraints that you don't find a company that can build what is needed. But a financial constraint, no, that's invented. That is invented. And that has been constraining the country for decades. And we continue having that problem today.
So are you talking about a kind of an ideological timidity? I mean, something that is self-constraining?
Absolutely. Part of that is very, very ideological.
Why?
Well, part of it is...
the training they get in certain schools? I mean...
Definitely, part of it. But what is most interesting on this, Richard, is the attitude of the private sector towards a government deficit. If the private sector understood what you and I are discussing, they would love to have a deficit.
Because it means more projects for them and more spending.
Absolutely. But you need to be careful with this. This is not, for example, in terms of the so-called public-private partnerships that we are generating now, because the government claims they don't have resources. It has nothing to do with that. It is a government that is willing to spend because it has a clear objective of what the Philippines, what we want to be as a nation during the next 5, 10, and 20 years. And the government is spending, and the reality is that most of that spending is precisely flows of income that go to the private sector. So when the private sector complains about the budget deficit, it's like mind-boggling. You see that simply they do not understand it. I mean, the example that I play often in this type of discussions, in presentations, is when I ask the public, I am the government, You are the private sector. What would you like me to run, a deficit or a surplus? You always guarantee, Richard, I've been doing this for over 20
Right,
years.
of
You get
course.
somebody who says, of course, a surplus. Then what I do is I get my wallet, I get a bill, a 100 peso bill, and I give it to that person, and I say, now you give me 200 peso. And then the face starts changing. Immediately, he said, this is my government expenditure to you, now you give me in taxes 200. People immediately realize. Well, this is, so partly it's the story of not even understanding it.
Wrong metaphors being used.
The wrong metaphors completely, etc., etc., etc.
The mental images are wrong.
The idea, there are
Yeah.
people even in the private sector who do not realize that the national debt is peso for peso wealth of the private sector. Peso for peso. In the Philippines, the same as it is in the US, dollar for dollar, or the same as it is in Japan, yen for yen.
Let's talk about inflation because again, we're trying to play devil's advocate, right? Because you're pushing back against received wisdom. What I want to ask is this issue of inflation because again, people are saying if you are, aggressive in terms of your spending, if you're not careful about your fiscal policy, you run the risk of inflation, and the inflation will hit both the top and the bottom. The bottom because a huge share of their income goes to food inflation, basically coping with food inflation, and the guys on top who inflation will effectively bring down the interest they earn on their savings.
Yeah.
What do you have to say about that? Because this is a really good contribution of our good friend Dr. Lisandro Claudio, right? Because he looks at how the Philippines is a country where you have both the left and the right, the super rich and the poor, see inflation as a singular
same way.
evil in very similar way,
Same way, yeah,
which
yeah.
is quite an interesting sociological phenomenon, I would say. But as an economist, what is the real deal?
It is again another misunderstanding that is linked to the previous question that you were asking me about how finances and how governments and central banks operate. In general, the answer is no, that is not the source of inflation. And it is not because, again, this has to do with old models that really disappear. This is not how modern economies work. So let's go back to the story of the deficit or the surplus, etc. So implicitly in your question is the government is running a deficit, and that is the source of inflation. It's a very simplistic story that doesn't really get to the bottom line. In modern economies, payments by the government to the private sector and from the private sector to the government are really mediated through the banking system. So when you pay taxes, what you do is instruct your bank to really pay to treasury in taxes. And where government makes payments to you, the private sector, to build a school or to build a road, is doing the same thing. You have your account number and it will transfer. So what is a budget deficit? Budget deficit means that at one point there is excess liquidity in the private sector. That must be very clear. The government has made payments
So there's a lot of money now circulating.
in excess of that. Now,
Right.
commercial banks are private institutions that maximize their profits. They cannot have excess liquidity. They need to get rid of that.
Right.
They need to get rid of that. That is one thing. So what they do is they start lending to each other. Some of them may have excess liquidity at the end of the day. Some others, they need it, so they lend to each other. At the end of the day, what we are saying is the whole system is in deficit. I mean, the fiscal deficit. So what happens is excess liquidity in the banking system. That, let me ask you a question. What do you think is the impact on interest rates that will push up interest rates or push them down? The standard argument in the standard model, which is a fallacy, is the loanable funds model, is that the budget deficit puts upward pressure on interest rates, which is part of your question.
Which slows down the economy.
Exactly.
Potentially, yeah.
That doesn't happen.
That doesn't happen.
The reality
it's not
is,
empirically supported.
of course not, but it's a question also of logic.
Right.
Excess liquidity in the banking sector puts downward pressure on interest rates. There is an institution crucial in the country, in all modern economies, that doesn't allow that to happen. That is the central bank. BSP operates as an inflation targeting, that is the mandate is to maintain inflation within that. What is the instrument that the central bank uses to maintain inflation is the policy rate. So if central bank is BSP, the governor tells us the policy rate is 4%. In the face of a budget deficit, there will be pressure for interest rates to go down. How does the central bank prevent that from happening? It mops up that liquidity. how they issue bonds. And the Central Bank of the Philippines has its own tools to do it. So sometimes they do it, sometimes it's together with Treasury.
So that's the house
et cetera, et
cleaning,
cetera.
that's the internal
Of course,
house cleaning,
yes.
yeah.
That is why you have a government that
Right.
runs a budget deficit, but that's not the source of inflation that we have in the Philippines. And that doesn't happen anywhere. Because if that were true, Richard, even a better example that the Philippines would be again, Japan. The Japanese
Deflation.
would give you money, would
Yeah.
hug you
Yeah.
for a little bit of inflation in the light of a massive deficit and huge debt, as you were saying, around 200%.
Right.
Because what they're doing is that budget deficit is constantly being mopped up. And that is the debt that you see. So all these things are related.
I mean, the better empirical. I mean, just look at the pandemic era, the massive expansionary fiscal policy. The only inflation for me, it was really the war, supply shocks. But if you look at it, both in the Philippines, even in the U.S., it did not create the inflation in spite of people were
Well,
looking
I don't
at
know if you
until the war
remember-
in Ukraine and all the crazy supply shocks.
I don't know if you remember that at one
Right.
point the central bank lent 300 billion peso to Treasury.
This is when Jokno was the
in
central.
2020.
Yeah, I remember.
In
yeah.
2020. Have you ever heard of that? Have you ever got any bill, have any letter in your mailbox
That you
saying
have
no?
to. No.
Nothing at all. It was an
Exactly.
internal
Internal,
transaction that it was done, and that's it. Not a problem. So what we are claiming is you are effectively doing that every day. Simply acknowledge it, and really use that for the benefit of the nation, instead of telling us stories about austerity, reducing the budget deficit now to 3% like in the European Union. In a country like the Philippines, it will not work. Because something else related again to the fallacies that are not understood is that at the end of the day, the financial balances of the domestic private sector, the government, which is the fiscal, and the current account, which is the external sector, are linked.
Right.
So in a country like the Philippines, that runs almost permanently a current account deficit, if you want the private sector not to be in deficit, you need the fiscal, you need the government running the deficit. It's very, very subtle what I am saying. This would be explained on a whiteboard, and that's what we
of
do to the
course, yeah.
students. But the story is not so difficult. What causes a crisis, by the way, is not the fiscal deficit. I mean, the examples of the European Union,
Yeah,
that's
yeah.
the best example. What happened in 2008 was the private sector running a deficit. So if you
Putting in real estate sector,
Of course.
speculative stuff, going crazy in
Massive
Greece and
deficit.
Spain and Portugal.
So
yeah.
what happened immediately? The government needed to act. So what you would see is that immediately the private sector went from a huge deficit into a huge surplus. The surplus was matched identically by the fiscal deficit. The same thing happened in all countries during COVID, including the Philippines. So the deficit of the public sector was matched by the huge surplus of the private sector, because these were the payments that the
Yeah.
government was making to everybody here. So you plot that. We have the data, of course. The data are public. You can get it from the central bank and from finance. You say the fiscal deficit, the 9-10% that we run, it was the 9-10% surplus of the private sector.
So basically, this is like the central banking as economic nation building, right? I mean, if you
That's
have
what
a
it is.
proper understanding of this, you can do
That's what
this.
it is.
And this is important because, again, going back, I don't want to do over-reference to our good friend, but our good friend Lisandro Claude got into some fight with some local economists over this issue, because our understanding of the dual mandate, especially in the case of US, is that you have to balance growth, employment, and inflation. And sometimes you put the employment and growth way above this. In the Philippines, it's slightly more different, and even some would say problematically, it looks like the bias is really price control, which sometimes comes at the expense of all of these things you're talking about. What is your read of that? I suppose you agree with that kind of assessment, but how do we get out of that? Does that mean that the Philippines is outside the realm of common central banking as it is understood by more advanced economies?
No, it's a very orthodox central bank. And I'm not using orthodox here in any pejorative sense. I'm
It's just
simply saying
traditional.
It's just traditional.
traditional, yeah.
The main mandate is this one. I'm really sure that
And
if
it's
you
by
are-
law, so, you know,
It is
like,
by
yeah,
law,
oh, yeah, by
exactly.
law,
That is what they will tell you. It
It's
is
by law,
But what people like me think, economists like me think, is that maybe the mandate of the central bank could and should change.
Adjusted, yeah.
Adjusted. Now, much of what happens in the country in conversations that I have had with government officials in finance, etc., is the fear of the 1980s, that we go back to that. So my answer to that
The
is
Asian financial crisis, I mean.
Sure. No, 1980s. Even worse.
1980s,
The
oh, the
1980.
1982 when it broke down the debt
Exactly,
crisis.
exactly,
Oh,
exactly.
yeah.
Exactly.
Oh, they go that far.
That is exactly. But it's the same as Richard. It's the same as in Germany. The obsession with inflation.
19
It's
Weimar
even worse.
Republic.
It's even worse. It's the Weimar Republic. It's even worse.
Which Krugman and the
Of
rest have been
course.
demolishing for
Of course.
quite some time.
So you need to appreciate that. But you
Interesting.
need to walk there and say the Philippines today, the monetary system, it's completely different.
It's
It
incomparable.
it cannot happen that
Yeah.
today. And if I have is praising, I mean, from a different point of view, I praise the mandate, what the central bank is doing. The central bank is not that it's doing a terrible job.
No,
it's
it's
just
not.
that it's doing his mandate. And what we are saying is acknowledge expand a little bit. Expand a little bit. Because if you as government officials in the central bank, they will tell you, well, of course we care about employment. Well, the answer is, why don't you have a target the same as for inflation? Why don't you have a target?
Let's talk about two other things which are very, very important to me, which is my obsession, industrial policy and manufacturing. Infrastructure development. It's going to be related anyway. So there's so much focus on increasing the capital outlay infrastructure spending as a share of GDP. We more than doubled it during former Jokno secretary. We're putting a lot of money, different names, build better, more. Unfortunately, we're getting a lot of flood control, ghost projects, etc. How to get the infrastructure question right? Because obviously Philippines has an infrastructure problem. But my understanding of you is that you have a nuanced understanding of what is wrong and what should be done with our infrastructure.
Let's begin. This is similar to what you were asking about corruption. Is infrastructure needed? Absolutely yes. I mean, look, one needs to just walk out in the street and see. It's obvious that we need it. But if you phrase the question or let me put it this way. Suppose that I'm Santa Claus and I have the power to implement tonight all the projects that the government is claiming that it has in the pipeline. So tomorrow we'll have excellent roads, whatever, connecting the country. The question is that going to give us a 10% growth? The answer is no. The answer is no. Because we need to understand what infrastructure and investment has two roles in the economy. One is in the very short run. This appears, of course, as increasing the GDP. There's an investment that goes on the demand side of GDP. But what you want to do with this is to increase the capacity of the country, build the capital stock. But as long as we do not have trucks using those roads and trucks that transport goods, manufacture goods to a port because they're going to be exported, they will not do much. All this will do is you and I will go much faster to Tagaytay.
Yeah.
You and I will
but
be happy.
Not adding to productivity in terms of economic activity.
Not at all.
Yeah.
Not at all. As long as we do not have... Remember, productivity, Richard, is something that happens not in your car when you drive, when you come to the TV station. Productivity happens in firms. In firms. And productivity
when they can export and produce and bring in the materials.
All that link, exactly. And as long as we do not develop that capacity to manufacture and to export, the roads, well, they will be exhausted immediately. Meaning it will appear a little bit this year, GDP will increase obviously, but that's as far as it goes. That's as far as it goes. So you build infrastructure because it is supporting a manufacturing sector. We have a very, very small manufacturing sector. We have some firms, etc. But this is not South Korea 1970, 1980, Richard. It's very, very different.
You want to go to that because, again, we have had conversations on this show. We also had Senator Gatchalian here talking about semiconductors. I come from Baguio City. We have been making Texas Instrument forever. So I grew up with this idea that it's not like Philippines, we should just export bananas and Chicken Joys and San Miguel beer. I mean, they're fantastic. I love it. Our mangoes are amazing. But I'm sure we can do other things, right? So I really had a hard time understanding why are we so complacent with this kind of a services, low to end, medium oriented economy? Why are we just relying on the business process outsourcing sector to generate growth and all of that? I mean, I was just looking at the numbers. It's crazy. Like Vietnam's total exports to the U.S. is almost 10 times our total trade with America, which is insane given the relationship the Philippines and the U.S. are supposed to have compared to the Vietnamese and all of that. I mean, I can go on and on and about it. What is your fundamental understanding of the weakness of the manufacturing sector? Is it because of the certain type of oligarchy, or for the lack of better term, conglomerate types we have? Is it because of lack of an industrial policy and incentive system by the state? Is it a combination of two and something else? What is your read of this, Professor?
You're opening Pandora's box here. It's a very long story. Part of it is simply historical reasons.
path dependency and
dependence. But it's very important to notice that Filipino policymakers going back even before independence, they understood very well the importance of industrialization.
right.
I mean, the Philippines was not different from India or China in 1946. These countries, India got also independence at the time, Indonesia at the time, and China was the end of World War II, the defeat of the Japanese, etc. All these countries understood that manufacturing is different.
Yeah.
Filipino policymakers also understood it. And even though there were internal battles in the government, different factions, etc., all of them agreed that the country had to industrialize. The tools that they used, different administrations were different.
Osmania
At the
had
beginning,
his ideas.
at the beginning
yeah.
it was, for example, foreign exchange allocation.
Right.
All that changed into tariffs, but they were behind it. They were trying to do it. My understanding, and the numbers that my team and I have collected, is that by the 1960s, there was some manufacturing sector in the country. Remember, the 1960s, the Philippines was not far behind South Korea, quite the opposite.
Well, we got the Asian Development Bank here for a reason, right?
1966.
Yeah.
So it is not that the Philippines was way behind. There were some manufacturing. In the government was very active. The government was managing hotels in 1960s. The government was managing railway. Manila Hotel was being run by the government. So there was something here. Something began happening in the administrations in between Garcia, Macapagal,
and then Marcos. Yeah.
Even though it's very interesting, it is not that Marcos was against industrialization. Quite the opposite.
Yeah.
President Marcos set up 11 monumental projects
Right.
to develop. It's very interesting because the period of very high, what is called the HCI years in South Korea,
Right.
when they were into a heavy industrialization, this was 1973,
Steel and
steel,
yeah.
chemicals, etc. In 1973, 1979, it just lasted for 6 years. It collapsed, but this really propelled South Korea in terms of the type of sectors that it went into.
Yeah.
President Marcos tried to do something similar, starting in 1979, 1980. It collapsed. And one of the reasons was that he tried to finance it with foreign debt. It became a mess. Then it was the story of the corruption, the story of the cronies, etc. And since then, the country has not been able to really get back to that idea.
So right strategy, bad execution.
Terrible execution. The implementation was absolutely awful. But it is not that the issue that we are discussing here today, we're into services. No. There was a lot of awareness at the time. All that was lost sometime during those administrations, little by little. And at one point, that's it. So now you have not only the economic, but also the political crisis of the 1980s. We reach the 1990s, and what do? Services.
So that's the inflection
Because we miss the whole industry, the years, the decades, the 2 decades that we miss is when our neighbors were doing it. What were they doing? Something that they understood much better than the government here, and that is the ideological component that you were also asking me about.
Right.
The role of the government. There isn't a single nation. I put my academic reputation on the table.
And you're not alone among the leading
In
economists.
history, that has progressed and made it into high income without reaching, without a manufacturing sector that reaches a certain size, and I'm going to explain in a second what it is, and the other one is that being led by the government. The government has to lead it, and that is what you call, quite correctly, industrial policy. Now, it doesn't mean that every act of industrial policy in history has been a success. Many errors. The story is the other way around. There has not been a single country that has succeeded.
That has not exactly.
Done it. That has not done it.
Right.
The other thing that is very important that we have found out doing research is that what matters for, in order to achieve high income status, is a certain share of employment in manufacturing. That is something that is not understood here, even by people who really talk about the relevance of the manufacturing sector. It's not the share of value added in manufacturing in GDP. It is employment. So
what number are we looking at?
Well, that's very important. I'm going to give you a couple of key numbers. The manufacturing value added in the Philippines today is slightly smaller than it is in our neighbors, but it's not terribly smaller. The big difference is in employment. So the Philippines, the most it managed to to do historically was about 11%. In the 1970s, when we are talking about,
That's the golden.
that is, which is very small. At the time, in all advanced economies, in Western Europe, United States, Hong Kong, minimum 30% of total employment in manufacturing. Hong Kong peak at over 40%.
Wow.
Korea, Japan, all of them, all the European
Almost
countries.
a fourth of some of the other
No.
rising
In the
tiger
Philippines, the
economies.
most we did is around 11%, and since then it has even gone down. So today
Single
it's barely
digit.
8%.
Oh, wow.
So one thing is to say, and the nuances are very, very important. We have a sizable manufacturing sector. We have about 4 million people working in manufacturing. So that's not a small. That is a significant number. But as a share of total employment is just 8%. Why? Because even if the number of workers in manufacturing increases, the number of workers in services increases much faster.
Right.
What is the problem that we have? And this is related to our low income per capita, is that the services that are really employ or work is a service of very low productivity.
Precariat, we call them.
Very much. Very, very, very much. It's the progeria story that Professor Raúl Favela coined years ago. Absolutely
correct. Yeah.
So the number that we have is that you want to make it into high income, let me run a number that you will never forget, 20% of your workers need to be manufacturing. What is the problem? That today is impossible to do that. Because at the time when our neighbors were doing that, it was a very different world.
Yeah.
Today is impossible. That is, when they were doing that in the 1970s and 80s, the big elephant was not still in the room, China.
Yeah.
So if China poses a problem for the United States, imagine that problem that it poses for countries like the Philippines.
China's shock, yeah.
Of course, much more. So that is really the history in a nutshell of industrialization in the Philippines. What we're claiming is that industrializing like South Korea did in the 70s and early 80s, it will not happen in the Philippines. But again, that is not to say that we cannot develop some kind of manufacturing sector much more sophisticated than the one that we have today. And this is our really big fat battle.
Well, speaking of elephant, there's also the Indian element coming in. Obviously, India is a very different economy than China, but I've talked to top technocrats, including those who work with Manmohan Singh, and saying, we made a big mistake not going on the manufacturing one and going on the BPO.
Trying to undo it now.
Exactly. And they're telling me, you Filipinos should learn from us because we learned our mistake. Now, good luck with India. I mean, they're having their own problems of transition into more manufacturing driven. But really, this is last part. It's important because you have a book project on this. So the question I want to put at the heart of that is, what kind of industrial policy will work in the 21st century with the advent of AI, second age of the machine, some would put it. Some would say, maybe the way forward is find the niche sectors you can focus on.
Exactly.
Make it a little bit more bottom up, rather than the top down like before.
Yeah.
A little bit also make sure it goes with certain reasonable performance-based kind of understanding, not this idea that will be Korea tomorrow, right?
Exactly.
What is your take? What kind of 21st century industrial policy should the Philippines develop? Maybe it could be too late for this administration or not, but if you're to advise 2028 next president of the Philippines, what should he do?
It is never late to start doing it. So even in case this administration has only 3 years to go, I would start doing it now today. Now,
what groundwork should this administration do in its legacy years? Let's say President Marcos is watching this. What should be his groundwork?
Let's start doing it today. Now, what happens is that the next administration should not simply stop it because it was done by a different administration. That is one of the problems, of course, that we have in the country. You have a new administration, and we have to undo things. There are things like this one that should be permanent in the economic policy of the nation.
Institutionalized, yeah.
Institutionalize it, because this has nothing to do with political factions, nothing to do with that. So the first thing that you need is awareness by the government to say, we are going to lead this process. And what we're going to do is to coordinate it. And what we need is an understanding of who are the agents of transformation in the country. That is the private sector. Let's just make it clear. The government doesn't do it unless you are in a centrally planned economy. And you say, I go back and I am the one manufacturing cars. That's not our case. This is a market economy. So what we need to do is to invite the private sector, do it. Now, what is the problem with our private sector? This is basically divided into two types of firms. The SMEs. But the SMEs cannot lead the process that we are talking about.
They don't have the scale, they don't have the capital.
Of course, the knowledge, the capital. Now, what is the problem that we have with our conglomerates?
Yeah.
The problem with the conglomerates is, and this is a market economy and people are free to decide what they do, so this is not a criticism, that they're into non-tradable activities, non-tradable services, and they're very lucrative.
Extractive, I would say.
Very lucrative. Some of these activities are extractive, some others might not be, but you're in certain sectors with a high profit margins and profit rates. So what happens? You imagine tomorrow that you want to say, I'm going to develop what I want to manufacture in the Philippines, washing machines. Well, immediately you will say, I'm competing with the Chinese, the Koreans, my profit margin is really, really, really down, okay? I need to invest in R&D. Some sectors in non-tradables are very, very, very profitable. But what we need is a government that pushes this and start opening these niches, because we have companies in textiles that we lost it. People think that this is really pedestrian, but you go to a 5-star hotel and the good napkins are imported, and the cutlery is imported, and the glasses are imported. But so if I talk about this, sometimes when I do it in presentations, people do not understand it. Suppose I tell you, we're going to develop a chemical sector. People love it. But what is the chemical sector? Glasses. We're going to develop a metal sector. That's the cutlery. But you and I, when we go to a fancy department store in Makati, you and I are paying a lot of pesos
to import,
for wine, exactly, for wine glasses that are imported, that are made in Europe, in the Czech Republic or in Switzerland, etc. And that is very advanced technology, by the way. So these are all the products that we call in the book that make a nation, and that we completely forgot about it.
Make your table. Make your dinner table.
We have a furniture. We have a furniture here. Make a table. Why don't we have DTI saying, in the next 10 to 15 years, we're going to develop a manufacturing, a furniture sector activity that competes with the Italian designers. We have some decent, still decent, shoe manufacturers in Marikina. Why don't I help them?
Yeah.
And they compete with Ferragamo in the next 10 to 15 years. I'm not saying that, and then little by little, you need to develop also in the country, we need to develop a machinery cluster. That is what differentiates the advanced economies from countries like the Philippines, is the machinery. They make machines. Because that also helps you, for example, employer engineers. So somebody was asking me months ago, I remember, how can we improve on the coconut business? And I said, very little. But I said, but we can do juice and soap, etc. And I said, you really believe that is going to make you a high-income economy? No. But I said, you need, whatever you do with the coconut industry, you would need machines that I'm sure that we buy from the Japanese or the Koreans.
I heard the same thing from folks in Copenhagen who are saying, like, there's so many low-hanging fruits you're not dealing with. Just really to end on this point, artificial intelligence, is it a hype? Everyone is talking about it, data centers, etc. I tend to be in the more skeptical. I'm still traditional in that sense, get the basics going. Get the basic manufacturing going. Not everyone is going to make tons of money out of artificial intelligence or whatever that's going to be.
No, I think there is also, I'm glad that you asked me about this, a tremendous misunderstanding. First of all, the generation of not just artificial intelligence, but all the technologies that we call the fourth industrial revolution, this is the domain of 10 countries. So 9 of them are Western countries.
One is China.
And the other one is China. Exactly. So we are really, really at the bottom of all this. This doesn't mean that we should forget about it. In other words, you cannot lose the train, so you need to train people, etc. But again, this is not what is going to make the Philippines.
It's not going to take you across the line.
Nothing. Something fundamental that we have not talked about it now. What is the big pending subject of this country? What is really dragging the country down? Agriculture. We haven't talked about it yet. You know that agriculture is the largest employer still in this country. People say it's services. Yeah, it's services when you put together all the activities. Individually, the largest employer in the country is agriculture.
But your average is like 54-year-old average farmer. I mean, the basic infrastructure is still not there.
Productivity is super low, and is about 23% of total employment. Rounded up 10 million workers. The largest single employer. Unless workers leave that sector, and the number of workers in agriculture employed, the country will not move forward. Why do I know this? Because it's the most basic lesson of development in history. That is, what do you think was the massive transformation of Korea or China more recently?
Land reform,
Sending
agricultural
workers
sector,
out of agriculture. For that, what you need is to create these other jobs that you are quite correctly pointing out in manufacturing. But until that happens, nothing. So this is not about thinking in terms of, like the administration does at times, bringing the latest technologies into agriculture, etc. No, we need to create jobs that pay 50, 60, 70,000 peso, and you will see how farmers in the Philippines will react the same way as farmers in other countries. They will get those jobs, you will get that number down, and it will be at that point when you will see productivity start increasing. But you will not be able to mechanize agriculture in the Philippines until workers leave the sector.
On that note, I mean, basics, but also outside the box. Thank you so much,
My pleasure.
Dr.
It's
Felipe,
a pleasure.
Jesus, for that fantastic conversation. I'm sure this is just going to be a beginning of hopefully a long series of conversation, because I really think at the discursive level alone, we have to make some big shakeup as much as we want to shake things up on the policy level. Thank you. Catch us again next week here on One News. You can also check out the long conversation on Spotify and YouTube. I'm Richard Hidarian, and that was a view from Manila. We're One News, all sides, all the time.